In March of 2014, FDNY responds to a call of an apartment on fire in Brooklyn, New York. These heroes respond, and they're able to rescue 2 young children from the burning apartment. The investigation ensued and identifies a primary suspect, who's eventually arrested, interrogated, confessed, and then is charged with the crime. In this 2-part series, we're going to explore the preparation of a defense team for an attempted murder case. We're going to meet Adam Heyman, Carlsen and Sarah Siegel, 3 incredible attorneys who took on this case and provide us the transparency of what it's looked like to prepare for trial. We're also going to be joined by Professor Maria Hartwig, an expert in police interrogation tactics and false confessions. We're going to learn why our criminal justice system is built on the premise of innocent until proven guilty. This is the Truth Be Told podcast, where we unlock the secrets of strategic communication. In part 1 of this series, we explore the initial response from FDNY to an emergency call reporting a fire at the apartment complex, and to their rescue of the 2 young children trapped inside. We'll meet our panel of guests, explore the roles of each attorney, and understand how an expert witness is utilized in a case like this. Throughout this episode, we're going to touch on the psychology of false confessions, stereotype threats, confirmation bias, and the importance of transparency in the courtroom. Let's dive in as Adam opens up about the details from the fire.
March 16th, 2014 at 2 o'clock in the morning.
All right, tell me what happened.
Yeah, just a couple blocks up the street. I was driving by there today, coming to this podcast studio. There was a really awful fire on the 5th floor of a 25 floor housing authority building, and 5 people are sleeping. An old woman who's kind of the grandmother, and then 4 children ranging in ages from 6 months old to 14. And our client was dating one of the people who lived there who wasn't there that night, a girl, and Thaddeus was dating this girl, and they accused him of lighting the ended up arresting him. And we'll talk a lot about this case, but a big part of the case was not only attacking the science of fires, but also attacking what ended up happening over 16 hours in the 78th precinct, which was that he was ultimately arrested and interrogated by 2 highly trained detectives, and then 3 fire marshals, and over round after round after round, and he ultimately confessed to this crime and sat on Rikers Island for about 2 years. So it was, our trial was about this time, like we were...
Yep, 7 years ago.
7 years ago, as I was reading through the trial transcripts, the dates were, and it was just, it was really awesome to read through it and to see it all happening.
How did you get assigned this case, and how did the 3 of you work together? How did that start?
So Adam and I were on trial. So Adam and I love to work together. We've worked together many times as public defenders. Usually we get our cases handed to us 24 hours after the person is arrested, more or less. They're seeing a judge for the first time. The file is randomly handed to you. In this case, Adam and I were on trial in front of a judge who was famously taciturn, really kind of emotionless. One morning we came in for our trial, and he was really hyped up, and he said, my son, there's an article about my son in the New York Times. His son was a rookie firefighter, and a journalist had been following him through his first, few months on the job, and had happened to catch that, responding to his first fire, he had been the hero who crawled through a wall of flames and rescued a 6-month-old baby from a crib, found the baby, pulled him out. And there were 2 children in this fire who were pulled literally through flames by like these just heroes, total heroes.
Heroes.
Gosh, I would have to just like brace myself every morning to go in and cross-examine like these total heroes in their uniforms with the brass buttons. Just everyone's gonna hate me. They were all in 9/11. It was they were amazing. So his son was one of the heroes, and he had the Times article with him, and Adam and I, in a break in the trial, started reading the article, and it was an incredible article, and about these heroes and about the fire. And then a tiny little postscript at the very end was that Thaddeus Boone had been arrested and charged with setting the fire. And we looked at each other and we thought, wow, we would hate to be his lawyers. What a nightmare to have to cross-examine like these handsome FDNY guys. We wonder who has that case. And we went back to our office, and it was our office. Our office had the case, and the attorney was about to go out on leave. And we went to his office and said, give us that case.
So he was being held just kind of right down the block, and my colleague asked if I'd come talk to Thaddeus before I was even assigned the case, but to kind of just talk to him. And this was very shortly after he was arrested. And Thaddeus was in a very, very difficult place. As one can imagine, being charged with a life sentence and sitting in jail. And I remember meeting Thaddeus for the first time before I ever was assigned to his case, not even knowing that he was going to be my client, and just seeing how the shell of the person that I ended up becoming to be connected with us, is he was not willing to just engage with the world. He was shut off. And I can't imagine what he had to go through, being arraigned, having more bail than you can ever imagine set on you, going to Rikers Island for the first time, and then just sitting there. And then he got transferred to new lawyers.
Yeah.
And it changed his life.
What initially made him the suspect, primary suspect, other than I'm assuming the relationship?
So the relationship, there was a fight, an argument earlier in the day about whether or not one person was cheating on the other, something like that. And this happened out in New Jersey. And the argument ensued, and it was alleged that Thaddeus had taken the keys to the apartment. He admitted to taking her cell phone during the argument and said, I'm keeping these. And so she went back to Brooklyn to where they lived. But it was alleged that he had taken the keys. He said he had never taken the keys. And so he had access to the keys. But there was also video surveillance. And that was one of the things that we really used to our advantage in many ways, as a defense in a very difficult case. You have to figure out ways to take difficult facts and turn them into your powerful facts,
right.
And so we're like, he's not running in the video. Like there were a lot of good things about the video surveillance, but the timing was that he walked into the building.
So he came to New York. So he had been out in New Jersey. He and his girlfriend had this fight. She had come back to Brooklyn. He wasn't from Brooklyn. He wasn't familiar with Brooklyn. And then that night, regret over the breakup, he came looking for her. And there was testimony throughout the trial from different witnesses who had seen him in different places in Brooklyn, because he had been kind of searching for this girl anywhere he thought she might be.
To return her phone, to meet
up with her, to try to talk to her. She wasn't taking his calls. And he went to the home she lived in, the apartment that ultimately caught fire, and he went to her father's house in another neighborhood in Brooklyn, and people saw him in both of those places, and he was on video in the building that caught fire, close in time to when the fire started.
He came first at 11:30 at night, and he was just standing outside the door, and the brother who was living in the house, who we'll talk about, who we placed a lot of blame on the source of the fire. We argued it was potentially an accident. There was incense that was left lit on the stove. Like we had a lot of different things, and she was a master at just throwing all sorts of other things in there. But he was there at 11 o'clock at night looking for her, going all over the place. Brother saw Thaddeus.
Interacted with him. Said, my sister doesn't want to see you. You don't need to be in this building. Kind of get out of here.
Leaves, and then at around 1:45 or so in the morning, Thaddeus comes back. The first 911 call is at around 2:11. So he walks in at 1:42. He leaves at 2:08. This is all on video coming out of this big. He comes back at 2:11. He leaves at 2:12, and 911 is 2:11. And so he was there. He had a motive, this classic motive that say, oh, they're cheating on me, I'm going to get back, right? And then he had a motive, and he had opportunity because he allegedly had the keys.
So I have to ask this, especially, not even just this case, but in the roles you all have, you probably don't get to be super selective on the cases that you get. So I'm assuming when you do get a case and you start to look at, all right, there's motive here, there's circumstantial evidence, and oh, by the way, in this case, we have a confession.
Yep.
And so, superficially at least, before you dive into it, is there an initial, like, shit, this is going to be like a tough
Adam and
case?
I had different perspectives. So I
Okay.
think Adam, from the first, thought this is an innocent man. You know, he because he immediately recanted the confession. The night of his arraignment, the first time he ever met the first attorney assigned to the case, Thaddeus said, "I am not guilty, and none of the things that I said in my statement are true."
And was shocked.
And he was shocked.
that bail was set.
He was shocked.
He thought he was going to go home.
Yeah. Yeah, great point. Adam, from the first, was on Team Innocence, and I come from a different place. I was a complete skeptic. I said, the evidence against this guy seems really overwhelming. This is a huge uphill battle, and I kind of feel like part of my role in this case is not, you know, necessarily a trial defense, but part of the role in this case is to align myself with Thaddeus, help him understand what taking a plea would look like. I had a reputation, I think, as a little bit of a plea whisperer for convincing people, you know, who didn't have options that they should take a plea, that was their best choice. And the plea offer in the case was really high, I think
15.
15 years.
But
And he was young. He was so young.
as much as I believed in his innocence, I also pushed him as hard as I could within the confines of my job to have him take 15, because I didn't want him to die in prison.
Well, what's
Yeah.
interesting, and I know we're going to get to Professor Hartwig on some of the science behind false confessions, but I feel like there's some correlation between attorneys trying to, I'll use the word educate or maybe persuade their client to take a deal. You're doing a risk-benefit analysis. Like, right, if we go and we're going to have to put this in the hands of a jury or a bench trial, what's going to happen? I would imagine the same thing's happening to the interviewee in an interrogation, and that's why they make that choice to confess or not. And so sometimes attorneys are maybe responsible for the same pressure. Does that make sense? Does that correlate?
Absolutely.
I put an enormous amount of pressure on him, and
Yeah.
he was completely unyielding. He said, people have to hear about this.
So he's initially arrested. What does that look like? What's that first interaction with law
The police had talked to the girlfriend and brought her to the scene, and then showed her the video, and she said, "That's Thaddeus walking out around the times." And
To be clear, it's a video of him at the front door of the
Yes.
building. There was never any video of
On the
him
fifth
inside
floor.
the building on the 5th floor. Nobody saw him in the apartment at the time the fire was
Correct.
supposedly set. There was no physical evidence whatsoever linking him to the inside of the apartment. And in fact, the family had taken some measures to exclude people from the apartment that night. They had barred the door.
they put a chair up against the doorknob because he had come back, and the grandma was afraid.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so they put a door.
She knew
a chair-
she knew her daughter didn't want to see this boyfriend, and she didn't know why he was there late at night. And they put a chair under the handle of the door. They had a small dog that would go crazy every time someone came to the door. But there was no.
No one saw him inside it. No one heard any noise. No one heard the dog barking or anything like that. And so,
But they had this video of him in. So to go back, they had this video
Yes.
of him coming out of the building right at that time.
which was like, you just got in a fight with the girl who lives at this apartment, and she said you took the keys to the apartment, and we saw, someone saw you earlier. And so they used the girlfriend to have him come back to New York. And so she says, "Can you come back?" And so at nighttime, he comes back into the city. So this is Sunday night, it's the fire, and he is just walking out of the subway, and I think you read some of it in the transcripts, but
He says tackled. He's
and
the
so
word
we
tackled.
wanted to kind of, because we had this forced false confession, we wanted to start it from the beginning. And it was even before then. He hadn't been sleeping that day. He went home that morning and visited his mom in the hospital, who had a brain aneurysm, and so wasn't sleeping. He was stressed out about having fought with his girlfriend, had no idea that anything had happened. And his girlfriend's like, "Come back into the city," comes back into the city, and he's just immediately tackled by the police. And these were really small wins for us that really helped a lot, which was that, like, these police officers were just not honest about the apprehension. And, like, he was, some people said, like, he was just walking and we sort of just arrested him, but he was tackled onto the ground, and his face broke the fall. And peed himself, and it was horrific, an intense thing. And imagine you're just walking down the street and this is happening, and when the police officers testified, having read it all back now, they just really tried to sanitize that. And that was a big lesson in this case, that these people were not just being honest about the truthfulness of the experience, and instead, by not being honest, we just were able to exploit that they weren't credible, and we were credible, and Thaddeus was credible, and it really was just, it was a gift.
Yeah,
and 2014 was before body cameras. This was before any officers were wearing anything that would have recorded. I think we went out, we tried to get the surveillance video from the subway station. We weren't able to. But so they couldn't see what had happened in the first police interaction. But they were already hearing, the jury was already hearing from the first officer testifying that not everyone is keeping their story straight about how they're interacting with Thaddeus.
Not only is not everybody keeping their story straight about how they interacted with Thaddeus, but it's obvious from that testimony that the police entrusted with investigating what had happened instead immediately thought they already knew what had happened and treated Thaddeus
they
physically
really had no
as guilty.
at that point.
I wrote down confirmation bias when you were talking, and that's what you're hitting here, and then we're going to talk about that when it comes to the interrogation. But that, I mean, if you just look at the circumstantial evidence, initially you can understand why he'd be a suspect, but that doesn't mean that you ignore contradictory evidence and then presume guilt, and that's what I think happens in an interrogation.
I mean, a lot of fingers were pointing in his direction early, and that's why they kind of just, everybody felt so confident, and they were willing to push the boundaries and just be dishonest about everything because they thought they had their guy.
Right.
They thought they had their guy and immediately told him physically, in addition to via words or any other signals, that they didn't believe him. They weren't going to believe him. And so that's a more uphill battle in terms of what he thought he had to do.
So now that we know how Thaddeus was first arrested, it was interesting to me to figure out how do three highly skilled attorneys with unique skill sets, not only get assigned this case, but how do they identify how are they going to work together and what role each of them are going to take? You're all getting the information and now you're preparing for motion hearings and then eventually trial. How do you figure out what each of your roles are going to be, and what's that communication look like kind of pre-trial as you're organizing all these thoughts?
Yeah, so Anna mentioned we had tried a number of cases together, and we're just a fabulous duo. We've taken a lot of impossible cases and turned them into just saving people's lives.
Killers.
I mean, we work well together, and there are a lot of great lawyers at Legal Aid. And so as we started to work this case out, we knew how smart Sarah was. She comes from an incredibly talented appeals background and is very good on complicated legal issues. And we knew that trying to get in an expert like a false confession expert in 2016 was going to be difficult. And so it was kind of an uphill battle convincing the powers to be to get three lawyers on a case. It was kind of sort of unusual. I know that I don't think I saw it. And I also liked the visual of having three people as advocates. And it was just helpful. It was like a 2-month-long trial, maybe.
It was. I mean, it was at least 6 weeks, and it was so many witnesses and so much to keep straight that it made sense to have. A lot of people.
I mean, if I'm looking at life in prison, and I want three Ivy League educated lawyers fighting, and so we were able to do that. And then once we figured out, kind of we got the thumbs up, public defender's office is going to support us here, then it was dividing things up and how to do that in a really helpful way. Because even though we were kind of all experts in everything, we kind of gave each other sort of certain specialties to focus on, and she was our fire person.
I dove into the fire science. I found it really fascinating. I knew immediately that I wanted Adam to do the homicide detectives. I wanted to see that fight play out head to head.
And we wanted her to be able to get, for one of the first times ever, an amazing false confession expert to come in and talk about the realities of everything we're talking about today.
Well, I think it's interesting for people that aren't familiar with either the court system or what your role is like, is how much attorneys, judges have to become experts in everything.
Yeah, totally.
A little bit. And I also think, to the credit of law enforcement and of the fire department, they're often tasked with being experts in everything
Yes.
too, right? I mean, you might have a detective who's an expert in interrogation, but all of a sudden gets a ballistics report and an autopsy and a medical examination, and they don't maybe know also what am I supposed to question. And so to put that back to all of you, at what point did you realize, hey, there's false confessions exist, or in this case specifically, we need to start to look outside support? Like when was that pivot point or revelation?
Well, I had tried a confession case. It was a rape case that I was successful on, but we tried to get her in that case, but we litigated, and the judge's like, I'm going to reserve. I'm going to see how this case goes. And the client testified in that case. It was a rape case. He was charged with a gunpoint rape of his roommate, and he wrote a handwritten confession. And we tried to get Maria in, and the judge said, I don't know. It was Sullivan. And it was, I think I remember being the judge. And we tried, and he did so well that we didn't need her. Because we were just like, we like this, we got this. You know, we felt good about his testimony, and we tried again. And
well, it's not that you didn't need her. It's that
it's not that I didn't need her.
It's that the judge felt the jury can completely understand based on this testimony, you know, why he
correct
made the statement that he did.
So what drove you to be part of the interrogation piece? Where was that passion or interest come from?
I heard about this case and wanted to be involved in it. I was really a baby attorney at Legal Aid. I had joined the practice a year before the trial and heard about this case and was like emailing Adam, who was like a god in the office. It's like, did you know about this arson science? Did you know about this? You know, here's this study that says, you know, these rules of thumb are all BS. Rules of thumb about when something is an accidental versus a set fire. That the National Academy of Science just said, you know, you can't rely on this stuff that's been peddled in courtrooms for years and years. And so I wanted to be part of this team. And then I had been involved with a different case where I was helpful on a legal issue. And I guess, you know, these folks were looking for somebody who could step on to really just deal with some of these complicated legal issues while they were doing some other things. And I put up my hand really high and was delighted to be involved at all, but just really excited to work with Maria and to work on the cusp of what was then an emerging legal issue it's just so important to the way that we understand how to tell the truth about something, and how to make sure that when we look at something and ask ourselves, like, how do I make a decision about whether this is true or this is false? Do I have any biases that are going to be important for me to understand to make the right call, right? Like, if you have a gun that you know leads left, you can pull to the right and actually shoot that bird or whatever it is. If you don't know what leads left, you're just going to keep getting it wrong.
I thought these were really great points from Sarah, as we have to understand that investigators, judges, juries, if we're not experts on everything, it's important that there's transparency in the courtroom and education and training in the process before we ever get there to make sure that the tools that are being used are resulting in reliable information. Let's dive a little bit more into the phenomenon of false confessions and why and how an expert witness is relevant to this topic area.
It was a really important thing because at the time, the experts that we were seeing coming into court were primarily, it was new to have identification experts come into court. So that was like, you know, you make a lineup or an eyewitness and you talk about the gun focus theory, cross-race identification, all these kind of things. And so this was kind of the next thing that we helped to push, was that scientists should be able to come in and talk about how this is a real thing. Like, just like DNA and fingerprint experts get to come in, well, false confession experts get to come in.
Maria, a little bit before we get into the case itself, and I know your background can be pretty extensive, but you're doing everything from, obviously you've done a lot of research, teaching, and you're also doing a lot of work with the project to try to just educate people kind of globally. So maybe a little bit about your background and what drove you to the passion of interrogation research.
So I initially came across the phenomena of false confessions when I was an undergrad, and our social psychology textbook was written by Saul Kassin, who I think you all know of, and the Central Park 5 case was described, and my outrage knew no limits. And my research is in two related areas. It's sort of like a Venn diagram where there is overlap, but there are some people who are doing research only in one of the fields. But the very, very difficult task of judging credibility or distinguishing between true and false statements, so the psychology of deception, that paired with interviewing and interrogation of suspects, it drew my interest because it's partly, again, moral outrage at the state of affairs. And at that point in time, I think this is really important to understand that was 25 years ago. There was not a lot to say about how the police should question suspects. At that point, we knew very well about false confessions, their existence, and nobody knows the frequency, of course, because it's just unknowable. But mechanisms, the psychological mechanisms of false confessions were well known because they are rooted in fundamental social, psychological themes. But at that point, the research was very, very critical of practice, but having not a lot to offer as alternatives. There was more available evidence on techniques for interviewing victims and witnesses, but for suspect interviews, there was very little. So you were talking earlier, Dave, about forensics and how, of course, the developments in forensic sciences they've been embraced by law enforcement, but not so much in the behavioral sciences. I think part of the cause of that is that the interrogation research emerges essentially out of the study of false confessions, and a lot of law enforcement officers, of course, get, what's a good word for it, defensive when criticized. Everybody gets defensive when criticized. To suggest to law enforcement officers who often project confidence and sometimes talk about having a sixth sense for bullshit and stuff like that, to essentially say to them, what you're doing causes a huge amount of error. It's not very palatable, but we know we have much, much, much better information to provide law enforcement with now, which I think means that it's a missed opportunity for law enforcement to not embrace the behavioral sciences, because there are numerous science-based methods, tools, not my favorite word here, but techniques that we know produces more accurate and reliable information. And on that note of information, false confessions are, of course, a worst case outcome of faulty interrogation techniques. We also have to consider the tremendous amount of just incorrect information in general that these techniques elicit. So, of course, not every time an interrogation is conducted does it lead to a person who is innocent to confess. Absolutely not. But it causes systematic and haphazard error in the information gathering, and it's the investigator's task to generate as much information as possible about the case. And these legacy methods fail in numerous ways.
One of the catalysts for improper interrogation techniques is the reliance on the myth that we can identify if somebody's telling the truth or lying to us based on physical behavior. It's surprising to see what our accuracy percentage actually might be, what cues exist or what don't exist. We're going to discuss that a little bit further with Maria in this next clip.
You know, you were saying earlier that whether it's lawyers or judges or, very importantly, police officers who are trying to figure out what happened, we are all tasked with being experts in everything that is relevant to a particular case, and even being expert in finding out what is relevant to a particular case. And when you have to be an expert, you're going to try to find a way to be that expert with whatever tools are available to you. And if no tools are available to you that are reliable, you're going to instead rely on what you think is a sixth sense for bullshit. But Maria, maybe you could speak a little bit to whether police officers generally are in fact better, worse, or the same as anybody else at telling whether somebody's lying.
There's not a single study that I'm aware of that in which police officers outperform lay people when it comes to detecting deception. Hundreds and hundreds of studies have established that human lie detection accuracy is just above the level of chance. So there's some reasons you can think of for why police officers might be better at it, but there's no empirical evidence that they are. And if you consider their decision-making a bit more broadly, we know that they are more likely to, they're equally likely to get it wrong as the person on the street, and the person on the street is not very accurate. However, the ordinary person is credulous. So if they're facing this dichotomous choice between is this a true statement or a false statement, they tend to believe the statement. We call this a truth bias. Police officers do not display that. They display a lie bias or a guilt bias. They tend to believe confessions, which suggests that it's just not general skepticism, it's guilt bias. And when it comes to confidence levels, we know that the level of confidence a person expresses in connection to their judgment. For example, I think you're lying to me and I'm 90% sure, has no systematic connection to how right you are. So if you're saying I'm just 55% sure and you're 90% sure, there's no reason I should believe you more than you.
Can I break in for just a second? Because I think a lot of people will be sort of shocked and resistant to the idea that they can't tell who's lying, in part because I think we're talking right now about a different circumstance than the one in which most people are trying to decide whether somebody's telling the truth. In most instances, people are going to think, like, is my kid telling me the truth about what they were doing last night? Is this student telling me the truth about why they needed the extension? That kind of thing. And in those instances, there is context, right? There is a prior relationship. And is that what we're talking about here when we talk about studies that detect lies or truth?
There are so many studies on deception detection looking at all possible, not possible, but a tremendous amount of variables that could be related to people's accuracy. So, for example, people very often say that if they know somebody, they can tell when they're lying or telling the truth. The research doesn't support that either. What research has found is something called the relational truth bias, whereby a pre-existing tendency to be credulous is increased even more. And also back to confidence, and the person's confidence levels are higher. So if we think about the characteristics of law enforcement's judgments about deception, having low accuracy rate, and I'm going to unpack that shortly because I want to qualify what that means. Low accuracy, suspicious mindset, and high confidence is a terrible decision-making combination.
Just to put different words on that, you mean like being really sure and also being really wrong.
Yes, yes, and being very inclined to think that you're lying. For an innocent person, that's a tremendously risky combination. So when I say that people are poor at detecting lies, it's probably better to characterize this finding as lies are incredibly difficult to detect. The reason that people cannot detect deception with any accuracy worth writing home about seems to be that there's just not enough cues. So if you think about this task of judging deception and truth, if you think about it as a diagnostic task, let's say you find that there's a disease and doctors are terrible at diagnosing it. That could be for two reasons. One is that they are looking at the wrong indicators. They're measuring blood pressure and heart rate when they should be measuring your glucose levels or whatever. This is very naive, but that could explain why they make faulty judgments. However, if the disease doesn't have any symptoms, we can't really fault the diagnostician. There's meta-analytic evidence showing that it's a better explanation to think about the problem as being one where the disease has no symptoms.
These are really great points made by Professor Hartwig here. Not only are the indicators that people are looking at for detecting deception maybe inaccurate, but they may not even be the right indicators to look at in the first place. Even more dangerous is how these types of indicators or cues can translate into confirmation bias or tunnel vision for investigators or really anybody evaluating the truthfulness of a situation. Everybody's thought their significant other or their kid or their coworker was either lying to them or something was going on. But we've all been wrong too, right? As you think, oh, this person's pissed at me, but maybe they just had a bad day at work. And then you assume one thing and it causes a conflict. But the worst it causes is a conflict, not a catalyst to coercive interrogation techniques because you presume guilt. And so I think everybody experiences that. And to bring that point home on behalf of the investigators is they're all human too, right? Yeah. Now, they have a hefty responsibility here to be more responsible than that. But what Maria, what you're speaking to is that same like confirmation bias and this tunnel vision. I got some circumstantial evidence that makes sense. We agreed on this is a suspect, right? And now, based off of maybe poor training or gut feeling, I've got behaviors. Now it looks guilty, smells guilty, feels guilty, and now you enter into this coercive, persuasive interrogation just to confirm your suspicion in the first place.
I mean, at the beginning of this interrogation, they had created a way that Thaddeus was going to be behaving. He's been assaulted on the street. Now he's angry, perhaps.
Right.
Now he's scared. Now he's very nervous about what's about to happen. Now he's presenting differently visually.
Yeah, that's a good point. And so earlier you mentioned a case you were going to maybe use Maria on, but it was a rape or sexual assault case. And so just change the context for a second. We talked to finish this behavioral piece. In a case like that, you have a witness, or maybe you have a victim or a complainant, and you have a suspect. And we talk about this a lot in the training, and I'm curious what you think about this. But if you have an investigator who interviews the victim and just assume
alleged victim,
complainant.
I appreciate that.
But they talk to the person who's filed this complaint, and let's say it's a female complainant, and she's crossing her arms and she's avoiding eye contact and she's kind of screwing up the story and she's fidgety. Well, the presumption is, well, she's nervous and embarrassed and uncomfortable. Right. The same exact behavior is exhibited by the accused, and the assumption is, well, they're guilty, they're nervous, they're going to get caught. But we've defined that behavior before we ever walked in the room.
There are studies describing exactly that process, which is the process of behavioral confirmation bias. The initial hypothesis or belief is that this person is probably guilty, and then you treat that person in ways that essentially elicit behaviors that confirm your pre-existing belief.
As we continue to explore the impact of confirmation bias in an investigation, another concept to understand is known as the stereotype threat. This can be a result of many factors, including race, gender, or even a person's waiving of their rights. After all, would you ask for an attorney if questioned by the police? Turns out one of the issues that works against innocent people is the belief in their own innocence, and that the truth will set them free. I asked the team specifically about these issues as it related to Thaddeus in this case. And then the question always comes up, and he got asked this, and you all can speak to this, but why not ask for an attorney? What did you guys see maybe when talking to him directly or during testimony?
That question, I was reading his direct, and we wanted to address it head on, because people think that like you get tossed into these rooms, you're just going to say, I want an attorney. And his answer was married perfectly with what we were saying with Maria, which is that innocent people don't worry about it, and they want to just tell their truth, and I didn't think I needed one. And
he thought it was a big misunderstanding.
Right.
The coincidence of him being at the location had led them to look at him, but he maintained that he was innocent.
But like for us now, sitting in this room, we're like, why the F did you not just Miranda up?
Right.
Shut this whole thing down.
Right.
I had nothing to hide.
It's in the literature. It's called the innocence paradox. Innocence itself being a risk factor, highly problematic, of course. But this sense that it's all a big misunderstanding. If I get to talk to the person, they will see or hear, understand that I'm innocent. So, yes, it seems, of course, naive, but that's one of the ways in which innocent people think that they're going to clear themselves by telling their story.
He didn't have a criminal record. He'd never been in any kind of scenario remotely like this.
Right. I think that's what a lot of people, like lay people, so your jurors, right, are going to think about, well, why didn't you ask for an attorney? If I was in that situation, I would have done this, 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 and this. But just like the environment, unless you're in that situation, you don't really know what you would do. And I would think it's the same as, like, if you get pulled over and an officer asks, can I search your vehicle, right? Innocent people think, well, okay, I have nothing in the car. When, if I got 3 attorneys in the room, what would you advise people to do?
Not consent.
Right. And it does, but the initial indicator is like, well, I don't want to not comply. And that's I think the assumption. If I ask for an attorney, it's like I'm being non-compliant, and that doesn't look good. So I got nothing to hide. So I think that we see that all the time. And I'm sure you've seen that obviously in the research, is how many people waive Miranda.
People waive Miranda more frequently when they're innocent. They volunteer to take polygraph tests more readily. So they put themselves at risk precisely because they're innocent.
Are they worried that Moran saying, I want a lawyer, they're going to look like they're guilty?
Yeah, sometimes, yeah.
And are there features of the individual that would make somebody feel not just, well, I'm innocent, so somebody will understand me, but also if I assert certain rights that I should be able to avail myself of, that will actually hurt me, like being black and a man?
Oh, yeah, I think the stereotype threat is playing a role. It's the fear of being stereotyped, which can have this ironic effect of being confirmed. So let's say nobody takes me seriously, I think, because I'm a woman, and therefore I become nervous and I stumble and fumble, and the stereotype is confirmed.
So a stereotype threat which makes you feel that you have different barriers than somebody else might to being believed. How would that play out in this context of needing to be believed and thinking that you will be believed because you are innocent, but being concerned about being stereotyped by the police who you must convince?
Of course, people of color are aware of these stereotypes that exist. And one thing that we've noticed as a pattern in experimental studies is that people with a damaged or lower belief in a just world, this world-spread fundamental idea that the world is a just place. People in general hold that belief, but to different extents. Even innocent people who have a truthful story, they might end up lying because they don't think their story is good enough. So they might make a number of sort of strategic mistakes because of their sense that this is a prejudice process.
As we dive deeper into Professor Hartwig's role in this case, it's important to understand and explore the phenomena of false confessions. In the last couple of decades, we've been able to have more visibility to the data behind false confessions thanks to DNA evidence and exonerations. I asked the team to help us understand more about the prevalence of this issue and how they were able to communicate this to the judge and the jury. It's difficult to quantify how many false confessions exist, and part of the problem is we don't know how many false confessions exist. Innocence Project, at least, reports, and theirs is based off DNA exonerations, is about 30%-ish of wrongful convictions contain a false confession. I think when you look at the National Registry of Exonerations, it's like 10 to 15%, but they're looking at, those are not all DNA-proven exonerations, so the sample size is a little bigger. And then the other number, and this one I could be wrong, but I think the recent number I saw is it takes approximately 14 years is the average after a wrongful conviction to be able to determine this person's exonerated, which means there's a lot of cases right now that we have no idea if there's a false confession or not. And that's so difficult to communicate in the courtroom. And I think that came up during your testimony, maybe it was during the cross, of how do you quantify that false confessions actually exist?
Well, the judge wouldn't let us during the direct. She started to talk about this, and we got stopped very good. Sarah got stopped very quickly because he didn't want to get into the numbers because he knows that it's hard to know for sure.
Right.
I mean, it may just be the tip of the iceberg, right? We're just talking about DNA exonerations. How many cases where someone confesses doesn't have DNA?
Right.
And so it really is like, it's hard to know the numbers. I think what was huge for us was just to have jurors know that it exists and it's real. Like getting to how many, if I'm a juror and I'm supposed to apply this standard called proof beyond a reasonable doubt, like just knowing that it's a real thing
Right.
is important because a lot of people think, like we were talking about earlier, like why not just Miranda up? A lot of people think that if you're innocent, you're not going to confess to anything.
Is a lot of people think, well, the only people who would falsely confess must have some kind of intellectual disability or have some kind of mental capacity issue, but that's not the case either.
The number, the exact number, again, we can't know, but the proportion of cases speaks volumes. I think conservatively 25% of wrongful conviction cases involve a false confession,
Right.
and up to 30%.
And this, I mean, we talked about this a little bit already, but it's unknowable because we just don't know how many wrongful convictions there are. There is
Right.
not DNA at the center of every single case. And sometimes when there is DNA evidence available, it's just not going to answer the question of innocence or guilt because, of course, I touched that. That's not the question. The question is, like, who owned it? Or the question is when you touched that or things like that. And so there are many, many cases where there's just no forensic evidence that's available to disprove that are instead different stories about what happened that you just are never going to have DNA to prove or disprove one way or the other. But the important thing for us to know and for the jurors to know in the case is that this is not a blue moon event. This is not incredibly rare. This is not some
Right.
wild hair that we're asking you to consider. This is something that really occurs and that we're really going to ask you to think about whether that happened in this case because we think it did.
Can a regular guy have their will overborne so much that they say something that didn't happen?
Yeah,
Right.
and do you need to have an intellectual disability to do that? No. Do you have to have a different kind of mental illness? No. Do you have to have been beaten within an inch of your life? No.
Low IQ, no.
Right.
Right.
So those would all just be factors increasing the likelihood.
Right.
But unequivocally, yes, anybody could be pushed to that point. The role of an expert witness is something that most people see on TV. Maybe they learn it from a classic movie like My Cousin Vinny. But the process in finding, qualifying, and in preparing an expert witness for trial is so much more complicated than that. The team is going to explain the importance of Professor Hartwig's testimony and the perspective of an expert witness trying to represent their field of study in the court of law.
At times, these police officers and fire marshals were saying, you're going to be charged with murder, they're dead, to if you just talk to us, we'll help you out, and to everything in between. And it was so incredibly helpful to root a scientist with what actually happened. And we talked before about how we just had Maria speak generally and not about the facts of this case at all. She didn't speak about Thaddeus or the experience at all. She just talked generally. This is what we see in the studies and the data and the research, and everything she was talking about happened in this case.
Yeah. I mean, we talked, like, in addition to the lawyers and the judge and the police officers involved in an investigation wanting to get something right, so do the jurors. And if you give them the tools to figure that out, they will use them. But they really, are interested in figuring out whether there are tools to use in these instances.
The preparation of an expert and the strategy of what is the purpose, right? How did you all determine, like, what is the purpose of Maria's testimony? What do you want to educate the judge and jury on, and how are you going to use that in the trial? What did that look like?
Adam knew that he did not want this to be Maria watching the video and then telling the juror specifically, at which timestamp can you tell that he's lying. He wanted this to be that a light bulb goes off for the jurors after they've heard from her, that finally they understand why the interrogation, that the part of the interrogation, the small part of the interrogation that's videotaped, why it looks the way it does and why he's saying the things he's saying. He wanted them to put it together for themselves. So she really didn't speak to Thaddeus specifically as a person. She gave the factors and let them put it together for themselves.
And we prepared a lot. This was Maria's first time testify. She had testified in Congress and other things, but this is the first time. And it's a stressful thing to do this job. You know, you have someone's life in your hand, but as an expert, you also feel responsible too, I think, in a way, to do a really good job. And so we had to make this thing as simple as possible, but understandable. And there was a lot of preparing, but not too much preparing, right? Because you don't want it to sound like someone's scripted or anything like that. But we also didn't know what to expect because this judge really stopped things very quickly, and then we were able to, Sarah was very sharp to argue how she's relevant, and he let us do our thing.
Yeah, I mean, I think we had two goals writ large. One was to give the jury the information they needed to understand that a lot of the things that are in television shows or popular media about how false confessions happen just are not true. So you don't have to have been beaten. You don't have to have an intellectual disability. The kinds of stories that they may have heard previously about how this event occurs, just, it turns out in the real world, doesn't hold up. Mm-hmm. The second thing that we had to do once we had given them appropriate information about whether to rely on those popular media kinds of rules about how to tell whether something is true or false is give them the real way, to the extent that we understand it, to figure out whether something may have been a false confession and what makes that more likely.
And then allow the jury to assess that reliability based off this new information.
Absolutely.
Education.
They really, the goal is we really did a good job in jury selection talking about why would an innocent person confess? Like, I think we did probably 10 rounds or 13 rounds of jury selection in this case.
Asking them, even before a single person is taking the stand, start thinking about this question. Because this is the heart of the case.
I think that was, we did so many rounds where you would get up in front of like 20 people, and like, I think every time it was almost like our biggest concern is that you're going to think because someone confessed to a crime they did it. What do you think?
Right.
And so that just got the people primed for this thing. And a lot of people watch television. A lot of people watch true crime stuff. They know that this exists, but like this was really like they were watching this thing, but they had a responsibility too. And back to expert witnesses, experts don't want to let you down, but it's also a lot you can't control.
Right.
You can't create a perfect environment for what it's going to look like to be cross-examined. Thankfully, the cross-examination.
Yeah, Maria, I was trying to remember, how did we prepare you for cross-examination?
Did we just
Did one of us pretend to be a prosecutor?
I believe we also did extensive research into her prior
yes,
to see if there was anything that might be.
We role-played it out.
Yeah.
I want to talk about that for a second because a lot of people don't ever have to experience being an expert. And in my short window of doing that, and that's what I want to ask you, it can be real stressful and terrifying, and you have a lot of pressure on you to not represent a client, but represent your field as the expert. But I almost tried to relate it to feeling what a false confession or an interrogation might feel like. So for me, and I want to see what you think about this, but sitting on the stand with all that pressure, you're trying to remember details because you don't have your notes and all your research in front of you. You're trying to figure out what are they asking next. You're trying to appease the court by answering thoroughly. But for me, all I want to do is get the hell off the stand and I want to get my information out, but I want to get rid of that pressure. And to me, that's the same as a interrogation. But did you go through any of that emotion in that process?
It was the most nervous I've ever been in a professional setting because I felt the stakes. And yes, I wanted to represent the science appropriately. You can do damage to the field if you do a poor job at representing it, but I think just more than anything, I felt a huge moral duty to do well, to really thoroughly and clearly explain how this phenomena works, because this guy's life's on the line. And in my world, the stakes are usually not that high. I mean, yes, can we screw things up? Of course, but it was unforgettable in that sense that I was acutely aware of what was hanging in the balance.
As we dive further into Thaddeus's case, I wanted to learn more about the setting of the interrogation itself. There's a variety of factors that could support the disclosure of reliable information, or conversely, increase the risk of coercion. In this case, we get a unique look at the setting, because this team didn't just talk about the interrogation room, they actually decided to give it a visit.
We went into the interrogation room.
Yeah, we did.
visited the
Yeah,
Right, you
precinct.
guys-
I passed it
yeah.
on the way here.
We took like a little,
Oh,
right
we-
before trial started, we did a little investigatory visit, and there was a funny thing that happened. We walk in to photograph the interrogation room. We had a subpoena from the judge to do this, and immediately spot in one of the detectives' desk, he had a big sticker on his desk that said "Blue Wall of Silence" over a skull. And I was like, we have to get a picture of this. Like, they really, because they put up a blue wall of silence here. Like, everybody's lying about
Yeah.
what happened. And by the time I got the photographer back, a detective was holding a folder in front of it and saying, there's nothing to photograph over here.
But what they didn't realize is that most people don't go into the interrogation room when they're preparing for trial and then use that photo to show the
Right.
jury what it feels like, because one of the things we really cared about was not just having Maria come in and talking about this stuff, but like putting him in that room from like 2:00 in the morning till 11:15 in the morning. He was locked into that cage on a wooden bench with no blankets, with no clothing, with not allowed to call his mom, who is in a hospital in Jersey with a brain aneurysm. And it's like our ability to like, and this is a lesson for every defense attorney, like when you're doing trials, go visit the scenes, go see what it's all about, because it helped us really to personalize the whole experience, because like there were detectives who had desks right next to the room, and I'm asking him, or you're asking him, or saying, what did you see? I don't know. But your desk is like right next to it. You know, like,
Yeah, and in a case that depended so much on what was on video, it's just so important to show a jury what's not on the video, what's outside the scope of what they're seeing, and that matters. So, you know, in the same way that being in this room, in the studio right now, is different in some meaningful ways from whatever will appear in the podcast eventually, these differences matter to juries' kind of experiences of figuring out who is telling me the whole truth here.
and the police weren't totally ready for us to come. It was kind of an interesting thing to be able to go into their world, so to speak.
And there was an event that day that had distracted everybody in the precinct.
And so we just came in with our subpoenas, and I remember at trial trying to get the photos in to show the jurors, and the prosecutor was like trying to object to them coming in for whatever reason. And some of the police officers would look at the photos and they wouldn't even admit that it was the actual room itself. They would say, could be our room, could not be. And judge, thankfully, you asked about the judge before, like, was he good, was he bad? There were good things about him, but he was just like, no, this is coming in. They get to see what the room looks like.
I think
You know?
initially we had spitballed, can we bring the jury to the precinct?
For sure.
And have them see it?
Yeah.
And so the prosecutor hurriedly compromised on, you can photograph it, but we're not going to go down the path of bringing them all there.
I mean, because you
To
talk.
all see the sticker that says blue wall of silence.
Right.
Yeah, they would have hopefully taken that down. But like you talked about, like the isolation impact of things, like during your direct, when you guys were talking about, they got to feel it. Because just saying you're in a room,
it's visceral.
and it was striking to see the room for myself. To be his advocates, you got to know their lived experience, and you can never know their lived experience.
Maria, I know this came up a little bit in the testimony, but just from a research standpoint, how much does the room setup, the environment, the logistics of that impact the effectiveness of an interrogation?
Exactly how much is very hard to answer precisely, but it's fundamental to understand that it matters, and it matters a lot. And these prototypical interrogation room that are just very, very confined, harsh, sterile, they of course prime or activate different concepts and mindsets in people. There is no question that the design of the interrogation space is an area where we can make a tremendous stride forward, because there's significant research showing that more open, more warm, more inviting interrogation spaces affect not only how people feel, but how much information they actually provide.
Now that we are inside the interrogation room, let's look at the context of Thaddeus's interaction with the investigators. As Anna's going to explain to us, there were a handful of unique interactions with Thaddeus and some interesting tactics that were used to elicit his confession. I want to unpack some of the specific things in Thaddeus's interrogation that I know you spoke to, and you guys probably have all these things memorized, but I have some of his testimony here. We're at the beginning of the interrogation, kind of put people in that context. And the fire marshals are doing some of the interviewing, so maybe can you give me some context to what did that look like?
Sure. So fire marshals went into the scene, I think, at the same time that detectives were in the scene. So the fire has been put out. There's smoldering stuff everywhere. It's carnage inside this apartment in terms of they tore it apart to put the fire out. And so now both FDNY fire marshals and NYPD officers are all swarming the scene, walking through it, seeing what they can spot. And so in this case, the reason that they became convinced that an arson had taken place was that they believed that in the debris they had spotted multiple points of origin. And I think they thought it would be, and so to say a little bit more about that, the fire science believes that you can tell where a fire started because it leaves a characteristic burn mark, sometimes on a wall, sometimes in a V shape. Mm-hmm. So I'm making a V shape with my hands if you're listening. That shows sort of where the fire started and how it burned up and out because fire and heat rise. And if you, in a scene, find what appear to be more than one point of origin, that shows if this isn't just a single candle falling over, this isn't a single piece of incense smoldering, down. This is somebody walking through and lighting multiple things on fire. And so they believed, we had a theory as to why they were wrong, but they believed that they had spotted multiple points of origin. So they believed that they had spotted one characteristic V-shaped mark inside of the bedroom where the baby was sleeping, and one characteristic low down on the wall V-shaped mark just outside of that room in the hallway. There was a piece of storage furniture. Armoire. Well, Thaddeus in his interrogation referred to it as an armoire, which
says the cops, and we're like,
it's just not a word that he would use.
Yeah.
But it was a cloth-covered piece of storage furniture, and they spotted a low-down burn mark near that item, and they said this was somebody walking through and lighting things on fire. And we are sure of it because we see more than one point of origin. Ultimately, what came out through cross-examination at trial was, our theory was, the fire had started in this room that was filled with things. It was burning really hot. The fire had risen. Flames had licked out across the ceiling into the hallway and caught the cloth cover on fire. And the cloth cover had dropped down to the ground, creating a second burn mark. That was our working theory, which I think is supported totally by the evidence and was supported also by the testimony of firefighters who were the first on the scene. They were crawling through this fire. They could tell us exactly what it looked like. And they saw, these things burning simultaneously, flames across the ceiling of the room. So fire marshals came into this investigation as well because they have to close their FDNY interrogation. And I think maybe the examiners felt having them switch off. If he's not talking to the police, maybe he'll talk to the firefighters. People feel differently about firefighters than they do about police. Let's all try.
Right.
And so they had teams of people going at him, and none of this was videotaped. Teams of people taking turns, coming in, coming out, asking different questions, trying different things. So for me, the most chilling moment of this entire experience was, so I said a little bit earlier, when I first met Thaddeus, I was not convinced of his innocence. I thought, this poor guy is facing horrible consequences, and boy, that evidence to me looks pretty serious. This confession looks pretty bad. We had not met with Maria yet. We had not, I hadn't gone into that piece of the investigation, but we were doing a hearing early on. So in the state of New York, you do suppression hearings before you get to the main trial, and you examine whether certain pieces of evidence are going to be admissible at trial, whether they were obtained legally. And sometimes prosecutors will make decisions to use witnesses at suppression hearings that they won't use during the trial. And part of that is that, the person testifies in the hearing and then they're not called again. You haven't just gotten a preview of your witness in the hearing. So if you call the same witness in the hearing and at trial, the lawyers have already seen exactly how that witness is going to answer questions, exactly how they're going to behave, and they're prepared to cross-examine them at trial. So sometimes they'll bring in the partner officer, the junior person, the person that they're not going to use at trial, they'll bring that person in for the suppression hearing. In the suppression hearing in this case, they brought in a very junior fire marshal who had not been on the job for a long time, and we would argue later had not been prepared to lie about what he, about something that happened in the case, or maybe not lie, but just not disclose that they had used a certain technique. Fire marshal got on the stand during the suppression hearing, and actually, let me back up even one more step. Thaddeus really believed in science. Thaddeus really believed in scientific testing.
And he consented to DNA, by the way.
Yeah, he consented to DNA testing during the course of he really thought, test me and you'll see I wasn't there. Take my DNA, take my fingerprints, take all of the evidence. Early on when we first met Thaddeus, he had this running theme of, I want you to do a smoke test on my clothes. And we would just look at each other every time and be like, dude, there's no such thing as a smoke test. We don't know what you're talking about. And he would say, no, the fire marshals did it. They did a smoke test on me. He said, we really don't know. And we really don't know what you're talking about. There's no such thing as a smoke test. But he wanted us to get his clothing out of the evidence. He wanted us to test it. We just didn't really know what he was talking about. Comes to the hearing, the fire marshal gets on the stand. He's describing what are some of the things that they're doing in the course of the interrogation, and he was really proud to tell us about a false evidence ploy. He said, this was the idea of one of the homicide detectives, and I thought it was so clever. I'd never seen anything like it done before. What we did was we broke open a DNA testing kit, which has a long Q-tip, and we basically told him that if you swab behind your ears, we'll be able to get smoke DNA from behind your ears. People forget to wash behind their ears. If they were in a fire, a long time before, we're still going to be able to grab that smoke DNA from behind the ear. So we swabbed behind his ear. We went out in the hallway. And then, of course, we just colored in the tip with a highlighter. But we came back in the room. We told him, look, you were positive for the smoke DNA. We know that you were present at that fire because, look, the scientific test showed that you were there. And we had no idea this was coming. There was obviously no documentation of a
from God.
Smoke DNA test, a fake test. Nothing like this is anywhere in the fire marshal's notes. Nothing about this is anywhere in the detective's notes. Obviously, it's not a video.
Obviously.
We had no idea it was coming, and I just remember feeling the floor drop out from me in the courtroom and thinking, oh my God, the person sitting next to me, he really got completely overwhelmed.
And still believed it to that day, it sounded like. Right, still believe that was an accurate test at that time.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
CSI, are you listening? You are hurting people.
Right. As you can tell, we are just getting started on this story. Thanks for listening to part 1 of the series. Please follow, rate, and share as it helps other listeners find our show. In part 2, we're going to dive further into the interrogation and the trial itself, and the lasting impact it's had on this team. Thank you for listening to this episode of Truth Be Told. Please make sure to like, share, and subscribe. And to keep this conversation going, follow the Truth Be Told podcast on LinkedIn and Truth Be Told CFI on Twitter. On behalf of the International Association of Interviewers, Rick Lander-Salowski, and our valued sponsors, thank you for joining us on this episode of the Truth Be Told podcast.